The dominance convergence theory was not a fringe idea. That is the first thing to understand about it, because the temptation in retrospect is to characterize it as the kind of speculation that serious scholars dismiss over their morning meals, the sort of elegant-sounding nonsense that sounds profound until someone checks the underlying assumptions. The dominance convergence theory was not that. It was the product of 600 years of xenobiological research, cross-civilizational behavioral analysis, and evolutionary modeling conducted by some of the most rigorous scientific institutions in the known galaxy. Its lead architects were decorated scholars at the Velthari Academy of Exoscience, the Keth Confederation's Institute for Cross-Species Analysis, and the Interstellar Biological Consensus Forum, which had been the galaxy's premier peer-reviewed body for the life sciences for 400 years. The theory was published, reviewed, replicated, debated, and eventually accepted, with minor variations in its parameters, by the scientific consensus of 22 spacefaring civilizations. It was as close to settled science as anything in the field of xenobiology had ever been. And it was wrong about humanity in a way that, 600 years later, the scholars who study that wrongness still find instructive. The theory's core claim was this: in any ecosystem of sufficient complexity, the species that achieves apex predator status, the species at the top of the food chain, the one with no natural predators and sufficient capability to outcompete all others for resources, will develop, as a universal evolutionary consequence of that position, a specific suite of behavioral characteristics. The suite was documented across 47 independent planetary ecosystems, in species ranging from solitary ambush hunters to pack-coordinating persistence pursuers to filter-feeding megafauna that simply outscaled everything around them. The details varied enormously. The suite was consistent. Apex predators across all documented cases exhibited territorial exclusivity, the systematic defense of resource zones against competitors of comparable capability, competitive intolerance, the suppression or elimination of rivals before they reached comparable capability, and identity through dominance, a self-understanding organized around the relationship of superiority to other species, such that the apex predator's sense of its own nature was inseparable from its position at the top of the hierarchy. The theory's application to spacefaring civilizations was the work of the Velthari exoscientist Pranas Vath, who published her landmark paper, Apex Behavioral Inheritance in Technological Civilizations, in year 3200, one of the Interstellar Reckoning, and who argued with exhaustive supporting data that the same suite of characteristics observed in planetary apex predators was detectable, in modified but structurally analogous form, in every spacefaring civilization whose evolutionary history included an apex predator phase. The modifications were cultural rather than biological. The territorial exclusivity expressed itself as defensive military posturing and resource zone maintenance rather than direct physical aggression. The competitive intolerance expressed itself as technological suppression of rivals and strategic disadvantaging of competing civilizations through commercial and diplomatic means. The identity through dominance expressed itself as the civilizational self-understanding that organized a species' sense of its own significance around its relative position among other civilizations. But the structure was the same. The evolutionary inheritance was the same. The galaxy's spacefaring civilizations were, in Pranas Vath's formulation, apex predators who had learned to use diplomacy instead of claws, and the claws were still there in the architecture of how they thought. This was not considered a pessimistic finding. The scholars who built on Pranas Vath's work were not arguing that civilization was impossible or that cooperation was fake. They were arguing that cooperation in civilizations with apex predator inheritance had a specific shape. It was hierarchical, transactional, and ultimately organized around the management of dominance relationships rather than their elimination. Species cooperated when cooperation was the most efficient mechanism for maintaining advantageous position. They shared territory when sharing was cheaper than defending. They formed alliances when alliance served dominance better than isolation. The cooperation was real. The dominant structure underneath it was also real. The two coexisted, and the theory predicted with considerable empirical support that when cooperation and dominance came into genuine conflict, dominance would determine the outcome. The theory's predictions had been tested against the historical record of every spacefaring civilization, the consensus. Forum had studied and it had held in every case. It held for the Volcae, whose cooperative diplomacy collapsed consistently when territorial interests were genuinely threatened. It held for the Keth, whose alliance framework had fractured 3 times in recorded history at precisely the moments the theory predicted, when the alliance's internal power distribution shifted in ways that threatened the dominant member's position. It held for the Serenthi, the Thresh, the Ulvar, the Prethi. 22 civilizations, 600 years of data, one consistent pattern. The theory was not wrong about any of them. Humanity was assessed against the dominance convergence theory in year 3312 of the Interstellar Reckoning, 111 years after Pranosvoth's paper, when the Interstellar Biological Consensus Forum undertook a comprehensive application of the theory to every spacefaring civilization that had joined the broader galactic community in the preceding 2 centuries. The assessment team for the human case was 5 scholars, drawn from 3 member civilizations, who spent 2 years reviewing the Terran Assembly's historical record, evolutionary biology, cultural anthropology, and behavioral ecology. Their report, filed in year 3314, was 58 pages, and concluded with a finding that the assessment team characterized as among the strongest confirmations of the dominance convergence theory in the forum's history. The finding was unambiguous. Humanity was an apex predator civilization. Its evolutionary history was unambiguous on this point. Homo sapiens had been, for approximately 300,000 years, the most effective apex predator on its home planet, a species that had outcompeted, outmaneuvered, and in many cases driven to extinction every other large terrestrial predator it had shared an environment with. It had achieved this dominance not through biological specialization. It was physically unremarkable compared to many of the predators it had displaced, but through the specific combination of cognitive flexibility, social coordination, and long-range planning that had allowed it to outthink, outlast, and ultimately outcompete everything that competed with it for the same resources. The assessment team's evolutionary biologist noted that by any rigorous definition, humanity was not merely an apex predator but a hyperapex predator, a species whose dominance extended not to the top of a single food chain, but to the top of the entire planetary ecosystem, such that no other species on Earth could be said to operate outside the context of humanity's decisions about what to allow. The dominance convergence theory's suite of characteristics was present, the assessment found, in every expected form. Territorial exclusivity. The Terran Assembly's historical record showed consistent and sometimes aggressive defense of resource zones and strategic positions against competitors of comparable capability. Competitive intolerance. Humanity's pre-spaceflight history was essentially a continuous record of the suppression, displacement, or absorption of competing civilizational units, from the absorption of neighboring tribes in the prehistoric period to the imperial expansion of the early spacefaring era. Identity through dominance. The assessment team's cultural anthropologist found the characteristic deeply embedded in humanity's most widely distributed mythological, religious, and philosophical traditions. The organizing story of the species across most of its recorded history had been one of humanity's special position, humanity's unique significance, humanity's relationship to the rest of existence as something qualitatively different from the rest of existence. The assessment was thorough, the data was solid, and the conclusion was by the forum standards well supported. The forum published it. The scientific community received it. The dominance convergence theory's confirmation across yet another major civilizational case was noted and added to the accumulated body of evidence. The galaxy's scholars updated their models. Humanity, from the perspective of the galaxy's dominant scientific framework for understanding civilizational behavior, was what the theory said it was. An apex predator civilization whose cooperation was real and whose dominant structure was the architecture underneath the cooperation, and whose behavior, when cooperation and dominance genuinely conflicted, would resolve in the direction the theory predicted. Then humanity did something the theory had not predicted. It is necessary to be precise about what humanity did, because the imprecise version is a story about human goodness triumphing over a cynical theory, and that story is both more comfortable and less true than the precise version. The precise version is more interesting and more complicated and ultimately more important. In year 3340, one of the interstellar reckoning, 27 years after He Forum's assessment, the Terran Assembly began what it called the Shared Horizon Initiative. The initiative was a formal program, funded at significant level, designed to share humanity's most strategically valuable technologies with civilizations that the dominance convergence theory's framework would have identified as competitors or potential rivals. Civilizations at comparable development stages, competing for resources in overlapping zones, with track records of the territorial and competitive behaviors the theory associated with apex predator inheritance. The sharing was not conditional. It was not structured as a trade or an alliance or a mechanism for creating dependency. It was structured as a gift, with the explicit public rationale that humanity believed the galaxy was better served by a distribution of advanced capability across multiple civilizations than by its concentration in a single one. The scientific community's response to the Shared Horizon Initiative was in its initial form interpretive rather than falsifying. The dominance convergence theory's proponents read the initiative as a sophisticated long-run dominance strategy, the creation of obligations, the establishment of a benefactor relationship, the construction of a kind of soft dominance that was more durable than hard territorial control, because it was based on gratitude and dependency rather than force. This reading was not implausible. It was, in fact, the reading that the theory required, because the theory did not allow for the alternative being that the initiative was what humanity said it was, and that what humanity said it was could not be true of an apex predator civilization. The forum's most prominent living theorist, a Velthari scholar named Vath Ospron, who had spent 40 years building on Pran Osvath's original work, published a widely read analysis of the initiative in year 3344 that argued precisely this. The initiative was best understood as the most sophisticated dominant strategy the Forum had yet observed, one that operated through apparent self-subordination to establish a position of moral authority that was, in practice, more strategically powerful than any conventional territorial claim. He called it dominance through apparent abnegation, and predicted that the initiative would, within 2 to 3 decades, produce the dependency and obligation relationships that any sophisticated analysis would expect. Vath Ospron was not arguing in bad faith. His analysis was internally consistent and his prediction was reasonable given the framework. He was wrong. Not immediately wrong, the immediate effects of the initiative were ambiguous enough that both interpretations could be maintained. He was wrong over time, and he was wrong in a way that required, eventually, either a revision of the theory or an increasingly elaborate set of auxiliary assumptions to explain why humanity kept not behaving the way the theory predicted. The evidence accumulated over decades. The civilizations that received technology through the Shared Horizon Initiative did not develop the dependency relationships that Vath Ospron's analysis had predicted. Several of them used the shared technology to develop capabilities that made them genuinely competitive with the assembly in specific domains. And the assembly's response to this was not the suppression or displacement that the dominance convergence theory predicted. It was, in documented case after documented case, additional sharing. When a Thresh research institution used assembly-shared propulsion technology to develop an improved variant that outperformed the original, the assembly's response was to request access to the variant, publish the improvement jointly, and incorporate it into the next round of initiative sharing. The competitive intolerance the theory predicted was absent. In its place was something the theory had no category for: genuine pleasure, expressed in the assembly's internal communications and its public statements at another civilization's successful development. The forum's assessment team reconvened in year 3371, 30 years after the initiative began, to review the accumulated evidence. The team was larger this time, 11 scholars drawn from 6 civilizations, with a mandate to assess whether the dominance convergence theory's predictions for humanity's behavior had been confirmed or disconfirmed by the preceding 3 decades. The assessment took 2 years. Its findings were delivered in year 3373 in a document that the forum's presiding committee found, upon receiving it, deeply uncomfortable to read. The assessment's central finding was that the dominance convergence theory's predictions for humanity had been systematically disconfirmed across every major behavioral domain. Territorial exclusivity, not observed in the predicted form. The assembly had over 30 years consistently declined territorial claim. It could have sustained in favor of shared access arrangements that reduced its exclusive control. Competitive intolerance, not observed. The assembly had responded to the development of competitive capability in initiative recipients with cooperation rather than suppression in every documented case. Identity through dominance. The assessment team's cultural analysis found this the most complicated finding. The characteristic was present in humanity's historical record, deeply present, embedded in its mythology and philosophy and cultural inheritance exactly as the original assessment had documented. But it was not determinative of contemporary behavior. Something had changed, and the assessment team spent considerable effort trying to identify what. What they found in the cultural and historical record was a story that the dominance convergence theory had not accounted for because the theory was built on biological inheritance and had not fully integrated the implications of cultural evolution. Humanity's apex predator inheritance was real. The theory was right about that. The identity through dominance was real. The territorial and competitive behaviors were in the history, documented and undeniable. But humanity had also, across its 300,000 years as an apex predator on a single planet, done something that no other apex predator in the forum's dataset had done at comparable scale. It had watched what its dominance produced, and it had not always liked what it saw, and it had argued with itself about it, across generations and centuries, in its philosophy and its religion and its literature and its politics. And out of that argument, it had developed something that the dominance convergence theory had no variable for. The assessment team's cultural scholar, a Serenthi named Uz Vathel, wrote in the assessment's most cited section, "The species that is the subject of this assessment is, by every biological and evolutionary measure, an apex predator with the full suite of characteristics the dominance convergence theory predicts. It is also, by every measure we have been able to apply, a species that has spent the majority of its recorded cultural history in active argument with its own apex predator inheritance, not suppressing it, not denying it, but examining it, critiquing it, developing ethical and philosophical frameworks that name the inheritance and attempt to account for its costs, and building institutions designed to express the inheritance's productive aspects while constraining its destructive ones." The theory predicts what apex predators do. It did not account for what happens when an apex predator notices what it is doing and decides to think carefully about whether it wants to keep doing it. The theory predicts what apex predators do. It did not account for what happens when an apex predator notices what it is doing and decides to think carefully about whether it wants to keep doing it. Vathosbron read the assessment. He read it twice. Then he wrote a response that the forum published alongside the assessment, which is unusual. The forum does not typically publish responses to its own assessments simultaneously with the assessments, but which the presiding committee considered justified given the significance of the findings. His response was 11 pages. Its final section was not what anyone expected from a scholar defending a theory that had just been formally challenged. It said, "I have spent 40 years on the dominance convergence theory. I believe the theory is correct for the 22 civilizations it was built to describe. I believe the assessment team's findings about the human case are also correct. I am not able to reconcile these two beliefs within the existing theoretical framework, which means the theoretical framework is incomplete." The missing variable is what Urs Vathel has called the examined inheritance, the capacity of a civilization to develop a critical relationship with its own evolutionary behavioral suite, sufficient to modify the suite's expression through cultural rather than biological means. I do not know how common this capacity is. The data suggests it may be rare. If it is rare, and if humanity possesses it to an unusual degree, then the question the forum should now be asking is not whether the dominance convergence theory describes humanity correctly, but why it describes humanity incorrectly, and what the answer to that question tells us about what is possible. What is possible? 40 years of theory challenged by 3 decades of data, and the response of the theory's leading proponent was to ask what the challenge revealed about what was possible. This is the best kind of scientific mind, the kind that has the integrity to look at disconfirming evidence and revise rather than rationalize. The forum honored Vathosbron's response by doing what he recommended. It commissioned the research program that would ND the following century investigating the examined inheritance, its preconditions, its development, and its implications for the dominance convergence theory's application to civilizations that possessed it. That research program produced, among other things, the most comprehensive study of human cultural history ever conducted by a non-human institution. A study that traced, across 300,000 years of human record, the argument that humanity had been having with its own nature. The study found the argument everywhere, in the earliest ethical frameworks, which were attempts to constrain the apex predator behaviors that early human communities had recognized as destructive to social cohesion, in the philosophical traditions that asked what the good life was, and consistently arrived at answers that placed the unconstrained expression of competitive dominance somewhere on the spectrum between insufficient and actively harmful. In the political institutions that had been built, repeatedly and imperfectly and with constant failure and constant rebuilding, to distribute power rather than concentrate it. In the religious and spiritual frameworks that, across enormous cultural variation, tended to place service to others at or near the center of what it meant to live well. The study did not conclude that humanity had solved the problem of its apex predator inheritance. The record was too honest for that conclusion. The same history that showed the argument also showed what the argument was arguing against: the wars, the imperialisms, the exploitation, the competitive suppression of weaker parties by stronger ones. The apex predator inheritance was real, and it had produced real harm across all of human history and continuing into the spacefaring era. The argument had not eliminated the inheritance. It had created, alongside it, something that the inheritance alone would not have produced: a civilization that knew what it was and had developed the cultural infrastructure to sometimes choose otherwise. Sometimes, not always, the sometimes is important. It is what makes the story true rather than mythological. The galaxy's relationship with humanity changed, in the century following the forum's reassessment, in ways that were not dramatic and were therefore not often described in the kinds of accounts that prefer drama. No great battle was won. No decisive treaty was signed. What happened was quieter. The galaxy's scientific community developed a more accurate framework for understanding what humanity was, and the more accurate framework changed the questions other civilizations asked when they encountered humanity. And the different questions produced different conversations, and the different conversations produced different relationships, and the different relationships produced, over decades, a different set of possibilities for what intercivilizational cooperation could look like. The Shared Horizon Initiative ran for 140 years before it was folded into a broader multi-civilizational framework. The Mutual Development Accord, which was co-founded by humanity and 7 other civilizations, and which operated on the initiative's principles but with shared governance rather than assembly stewardship. The transition from assembly-led to jointly governed was explicitly designed to eliminate the benefactor relationship that the dominance convergence theory's proponents had originally predicted the initiative would create. The assembly proposed the transition itself, before any other party requested it, on the grounds that the initiative's purpose was better served by the accord's structure. Vathos Braun, who lived to see the transition, noted in his final published essay that the proposal was exactly what the examined inheritance looked like in practice. The apex predator inheritance pushing toward the benefactor dominant structure, the examined inheritance asking whether that structure served the stated purpose, and the assembly choosing the purpose over the structure. The examined inheritance pushing toward one thing, the examined inheritance asking whether that was right, and the choice going to the question rather than the push. He wrote, "I built a theory about what apex predators do. I should have built a theory about what apex predators do when they have been paying attention to themselves long enough to notice. I did not know the second theory was necessary because I had not encountered a civilization that required it. I have now. It has cost me a theory and given me something better, a question I did not know to ask. What else becomes possible when a species with the full power of an apex predator decides to examine what it wants to do with that power? I do not know the answer. I am no longer certain the answer has a ceiling. What else becomes possible?" He asked the question in year 3412 of the Interstellar reckoning. The galaxy has been answering it in the slow accumulati on of data that real history produces for the 600 years since. The answer is not finished. It will not be finished in this historian's lifetime or in the lifetime of anyone this account reaches. But the direction of the answer has been visible since the moment the Shared Horizon Initiative's first technology package arrived at its first recipient civilization and was used not to create dependency, but to build capability, and the assembly saw the capability being built and responded not with suppression but with more sharing. The universe has one rule: apex predators do not share territory. The rule is real. The data behind it is 600 years old and covers 47 planetary ecosystems and 22 spacefaring civilizations, and it has never been wrong. Humanity did not get the memo, not because the memo was not sent, because humanity had been reading a different document 300,000 years long, written in every language it had ever spoken, arguing with itself about what it wanted to be, and by the time the memo arrived, humanity had already decided that the rule described what apex predators did when they were not paying attention, and that paying attention was the whole point. If this story reached something in you, if it made you feel what it means to look at your own nature and choose what to do with it, hit that like button right now. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe and ring the bell because there are more stories like this one and you do not want to miss them.